Thank you very much. When I was first at IFPRI, it seemed a bit much to be called Director General of this small organization. I think, particularly thanks to the effort of Joachim and his colleagues, I think it is the proper term now. And occasionally, when I want to seem important, I claim I was the Director General of IFPRI, even though it wasn't quite true. We had, I think, 5 programs then, and they all had directors too. So there's a little confusion who was in charge of what when I was here. The title of this, I have to take full credit for that, or discredit, and for those of you who figured out what the title is and what it says, the answer is no, unfortunately, and that will gradually come through. And the 50 years of experience, I didn't want to say how long it really was, because I thought you might think I was terribly old in that case, but my first consulting assignment on foreign aid was in 1952. I think there's several people here who may not have been conceived in 1952, and that was helping deal with how to raise labor productivity in the dairy industry in the United Kingdom, which was a major foreign aid recipient at that time. That was a fun assignment. As I prepared, I'm very worried that you're going to find this a very disappointing presentation. And as I prepared, the reason that I'm worried it's going to be disappointing is I'm going to cover a lot of territory, and I'm trying to paint a big picture about what has to be done in foreign aid if we're really going to see poverty declining in low-income countries. And a lot of what I run over will be old stuff to you. I hope that the way I've put it together will be somewhat new. But my greatest concern was that I wasn't saying anything that was sort of stimulating and sort of controversial. Somewhat belatedly, but I read a piece on Afghanistan by Sergei Mikhailov, who's the former director of the French AFD program. And he states in what he wrote that it'll be extremely controversial and very few people will agree with it. Well, I agreed with everything in it, and I'm saying very similar things, but bringing it down to somewhat more nitty-gritty positions than he laid out. A lot of what I'm going to say is fairly negative. I want to start on a positive note. I've had substantial efforts over the last several months in Indonesia, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, in each case working with the USAID mission. And in each of those cases, I found a really major change in the direction of being concerned with building national institutions, having an impact on national aggregates, and an emphasis on agriculture, 3 things I want to talk about today. But these are all middle-income countries, and what I want to address today is the problem of the low-income countries. The low-income countries are basically essentially all of sub-Saharan Africa, a couple of Asian countries, Nepal, Afghanistan, maybe another odd one here and there, and a little peculiar, significant parts of Latin America. And the parts that I have in mind of thinking of as low income are the smallholder highland areas, such as the Altiplano of Guatemala. These are the areas from which a very high proportion of the illegal immigration, I guess it's all illegally going back across the border now with the economic situation. But there are areas in Latin America which would qualify if they were separated off as low-income countries from this point of view. What characterizes the countries I'm talking about? Number one, they have fragile governments. And this pushes us in the direction of supporting those fragile governments. And that's one of the major problems in U.S. foreign aid now, its lack of support for the government. And I'll give some details on that shortly. Secondly, a very high proportion of the populations are under the poverty line. They're food insecure people, amongst other things. The countries are largely rural, and when I talk about portions of Latin America, the Altiplano of Guatemala, unlike the country as a whole, is a rural area. and well over 25% of GDP is generated in the agricultural sector. So when we talk about the low-income countries, unlike the middle-income countries, we're talking about countries which are dominated by the rural sector, dominated both on economic growth and on employment by agriculture. Without exception, maybe one or two small exceptions, Somalia, et cetera, they have the bulk of their rural population, not the bulk of the land, but the bulk of their rural population on productive agricultural resources that can be made a great deal more productive, so that there's tremendous potential for agricultural growth in these very rural countries. And I want to come back to this point later, but the rate of return in low-income countries to investment in health and education is very low. Now, that's a little bit contrary to a good deal of literature. Why is it low? First of all, these are rural countries in large part, high proportion of the population in rural areas. You have very low nutritional status, especially amongst children. And we know that where the nutritional status is low, the other health and education programs are not very effective. The physical infrastructure, the roads and so on, are very poor. So you have, this was done quite some time ago, but a number of years ago, David Son did a study in which he noted the increase in relative emphasis in health and education programs in low-income countries in rural areas, and noticed that at the same time the relative emphasis on the rural sector was going up, the disparity between the urban and the rural areas was increasing. This simply tells you that the rate of return on education and health money in low-income countries for those kinds of reasons is relatively low. Extrapolating from what David Son did, I would say that the rural areas of low-income countries for health and education have the same problem that agriculture has, that you can't get educated people to go and live in these rural areas because they don't have adequate facilities for an educated family. So they tend to live where there's a good road, and maybe they get out to the rural areas. So your health and education money builds clinics and it builds schools, but it doesn't get them staffed. And this is a point to which I want to return later, because I do want to emphasize the huge imbalance that we have in aid allocations amongst elements that are highly complementary to each other. Now, I want to spend just a minute now, and then this is what I'll come back on. I want to emphasize what I see as the basic loss of focus in foreign aid, obviously from the point of view of the topic of this presentation, from the point of view of poverty reduction and food security. The first major shift that's very important from the point of view of what we're talking about here is a shift away, as we had under the Marshall Plan, as we did in the 50s and 60s in Asia, a shift away from a national focus of foreign aid efforts, trying to get change in national aggregates, the total number of women who are lifted up, the increase in GDP, the increase in the national rate of growth of the agricultural sector. We've shifted away from that to individual discrete projects, which are judged in a number of ways, but they're particularly judged by whether they're getting an adequate rate of return on the investment of the aid funds. Never mind that getting that good rate of return here was partly because you demanded matching funds and pulled them away from there, and therefore got a pretty good rate of return. So you lifted up 150 women here. Meanwhile, 5,000 fell down somewhere else, and so on around. So this has been a major shift. That aid projects that are put out for contracts are discrete, usually small geographic areas, discrete projects which are not judged by their impact on national aggregates. Secondly, a shift away from building of national institutions. And I'm reminded, someone brought it to my attention yesterday, that I'm held in rather low regard in the U.S. aid mission in Afghanistan. Why? because I'm considered very pro-public sector. Well, this is pretty amusing for a lifelong Republican, okay, that I've been very private sector oriented from the very beginning. But when you have a fragile government, it becomes very important to security, all the things which are necessary to get economic development, to have support for that government. And you may have to support it in areas which eventually should be in the private sector, but which in the short run have to be in the government sector. So that we've drawn back from building national institutions, and as part of that, we've drawn back from supporting the fragile governments. And of course, that's nowhere more true than it is in Afghanistan. Foreign aid from all countries, it isn't just the U.S., gives very little support to the national institutions of the Afghan government. There are a couple of exceptions. There's a Ministry of Rural Development that gets a lot of support, partly because DFID believes in these non-agricultural types of things in rural areas. Parts of the Health Ministry get some support, and so on. This shift from emphasis on national institutions is part of the very simplistic atmosphere around present-day macroeconomics and the market orientation that comes out of present-day macroeconomics. I can remember back in the late 50s when Nicky Kaldor, that's probably a name not many of you know, but he was a very prominent macroeconomist of that period from the UK. I remember his coming out to India and lecturing, and would start off, I heard 2 or 3 lectures from him there, he'd start off by saying something about agriculture, how important it was, how important public institutions were in building agriculture, and then he'd end this short introduction by saying, and I hope somebody's doing something about that. Now I'm going to talk about the things I know about. Well, you'll never hear of a contemporary macroeconomist going out to a developing country and beginning his remarks with those kinds of statements. The attitude now is that, yeah, maybe you're right, agriculture is important, but if it is, the market will take care of it. And so we've had that push from what I call naive, not all macroeconomists are naive, I suppose, but this sort of naive macroeconomics pushing us away from building national public institutions. The third shift is a huge underestimation of the crucial importance of technological change to all aspects of economic development, from health to education, and of course to agriculture. That underestimation has played a role in almost complete abandonment of high-level training for people from low-income countries. We used to do a tremendous amount of PhD-level training. You go to Indonesia now, the agricultural research system is staffed almost entirely by people trained under foreign aid. 40% of those remaining will be retiring in the next 3 years. We just got out of that business so prematurely that it was not reasonable to expect the national government to step in and pick it up. And there's obviously been a radical reduction in the technical competence of foreign aid agencies. And most of what I'm saying applies across the board in foreign aid agencies. I think the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank have been a little backward in following the U.S. into these horrible directions. But even there, the technical competence has greatly declined. The proportion of technically competent people has greatly declined over the years. And that's been very unfortunate for economic growth. It's been particularly unfortunate for the agricultural sector. And then the fourth point I want to make about changes has been a massive shift away from emphasis on growth and of any kind of growth and emphasis on, of course, agriculture within that. And the shift has been towards the social sectors. And I want to make a comment later about the complementarity of these elements. I just looked at the 2008 allocations of U.S. foreign aid. 2% went to agriculture. The proportion that went to the health sector was 20 times as large as the proportion that went to agriculture. Education, of course, isn't nearly as big as health, but it's way, way larger than agriculture. Then there must, in a list of about 20 line items, there must be at least a dozen as big as agriculture that are all sorts of weird kinds of things that have to do with funny aspects of governance and so on, about which we probably don't know very much. One way to make the complementarity point is to say that if Osama bin Laden was dreaming up an aid program, he would surely want an aid program which generated a lot of healthy, educated males without a job. And that's a good complementarity from his point of view, right? And that's absolutely the wrong complementarity from the point of view of what most of us have as objectives. That you do have to worry about the balance between the creation of jobs, I'm going to come to that shortly, the creation of jobs and the extent to which you are preparing people for those jobs in terms of their health and what have you.